They called him the Devil Duke of Blackstone, a man whose cold stare could silence a room, whose reputation for ruthlessness made even hardened lords step aside when he entered. Alexander Ashford had buried 2 fiancées before their wedding days, and London whispered that he was cursed, or worse, that he was the curse himself. So when Miss Evelyn Hartley found herself standing at the altar beside this terrifying man, not by choice but by her father's gambling debts, she expected cruelty. She expected ice. She expected nothing. What she didn't expect was for him to turn to the 300 witnesses gathered in that cathedral, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade, and make a promise so shocking, so impossibly tender, that even the Archbishop gasped, a promise that would either save her or destroy them both. This is the story of how London's most feared duke fell to his knees before the woman who refused to fear him. The summons came on a cold March evening in 1848. Evelyn sat in the drawing room of their modest townhouse, embroidering by candlelight, when her father's voice echoed through the hallway. His tone carried an edge she recognized all too well. Desperation. Evelyn. My study now. She set down her needlework with trembling hands. Nothing good ever came from being called to her father's study at this hour. As she walked down the dim corridor, she could hear him pacing behind the heavy oak door, his footsteps quick and agitated. Lord Edmund Hartley stood by the window when she entered, his back to her. His shoulders sagged beneath his coat, and even in the firelight she could see the grey that had crept into his hair over the past year. The gambling had aged him. "Father," she said softly. He turned, and the look on his face made her stomach drop. It was the expression of a drowning man grasping for anything to keep him afloat. "I've made a mistake," he said, his voice rough. A terrible mistake. Evelyn had heard this before, too many times. The card games that went too long, the bets placed with too much confidence, the debts that piled higher each month. How much this time? She asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. £15,000. The number hit her like a physical blow. 15,000. They didn't have 1,500. Their townhouse was mortgaged. The country estate had been sold 2 years ago. Her mother's jewelry gone. Her brother Thomas had left Oxford because they couldn't pay his tuition. To whom? She whispered. Her father's hands shook as he poured himself a brandy. He drank it in one swallow before he could answer. The Duke of Blackstone, the room seemed to tilt. Everyone in London knew that name. Alexander Ashford, the 7th Duke of Blackstone. The man they called the Devil Duke. The man whose fiancées died. "No," Evelyn breathed. "Father, no. Tell me you didn't." "I had no choice," he said, his voice breaking. "The game was private. I thought I could win it back." "You thought wrong," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice even as her world crumbled. "And you always think wrong." He flinched but didn't argue. He couldn't. They both knew the truth. "What does he want?" Evelyn asked, though somewhere deep inside she already knew the answer. Men like the Duke of Blackstone didn't need money. They had power. They had titles. What they wanted was something else entirely. Her father couldn't meet her eyes. He's offered to forgive the entire debt. Every penny. And he'll settle an additional sum on Thomas, enough to complete his education and establish himself properly. In exchange for what? The silence stretched between them like a chasm. "In exchange for you," her father finally said. As his wife, the words hung in the air, impossible and yet terrifyingly real. Evelyn gripped the back of a chair to steady herself. Her mind raced through everything she knew about the Duke of Blackstone, all the whispered stories that circulated through London's drawing rooms. His first fiancée, Lady Caroline Westbrook, had died 3 days before their wedding. A carriage accident on the road to his estate. The horses had spooked, they said. The carriage had overturned. She'd broken her neck. His second fiancée, Miss Isabel Rothford, had made it closer to the altar. But a week before the ceremony, she'd taken ill. A sudden fever. She was dead within 3 days. The doctors couldn't explain it. Some said it was her heart. Others whispered darker theories. 2 women. 2 deaths. 2 weddings that never happened. And now her father wanted to make her the 3rd. "You're selling me," Evelyn said quietly. "Not a question. A fact. I'm saving our family," her father shot back, but there was no conviction in his voice. "Thomas can finish school. The debts will be cleared. You'll be a duchess, for God's sake. The Duchess of Blackstone. Do you understand what that means? It means I'll likely be dead before the year is out. That's superstitious nonsense, her father said, but he couldn't look at her. Accidents happen. Illness happens. The Duke is a war hero. He's one of the wealthiest men in England. He's killed 2 women, Evelyn said. He's done no such thing. There's no proof of that. Just gossip from bitter people with nothing better to do. Evelyn wanted to scream. She wanted to rage at him for his weakness, his selfishness, his endless mistakes that always seemed to fall on everyone else to fix. But what good would it do? The debt was real. The Duke's offer was real, and her choices had just narrowed to one. Does he know? She asked. Does the Duke know that you're trading your daughter to clear your gambling debts? Her father poured another brandy. He knows the situation. He's the one who proposed the arrangement. Of course he had. Men like Alexander Ashford didn't lose at cards by accident. They played with purpose, and somehow her father had walked right into whatever trap the devil Duke had set. When? Evelyn's voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. The wedding is set for 1 week from today. 7 days. 7 days to prepare for a marriage that might be her death sentence. That night, Evelyn couldn't sleep. She sat by her bedroom window, watching the London streets below, and tried to understand how her life had come to this. 23 years old, never been in love, never been kissed, never even had a proper season, because her father had gambled away the money for it. And now she was going to marry a man that society called cursed. Her maid, Alice, had come to her room after midnight, her eyes red from crying. Word had spread through the servants' quarters. Everyone knew what was happening. Everyone knew what it meant, Miss Evelyn, Alice had whispered. You can't marry him. They say he's got the devil in him. They say his first lady tried to run away. That's why the carriage crashed. They say the second one, Miss Isabel, she took poison rather than marry him. Evelyn had held Alice's hand and said nothing. What could she say? That she was terrified. That she'd spent the last hour imagining 100 ways she might die. That she'd already started writing letters to Thomas, telling him to be strong, to use the Duke's money wisely, to remember her. I have to, Evelyn had finally said. Thomas needs to finish school. You and the other servants need your positions. If I don't do this, we lose everything. Alice had sobbed then, and Evelyn had comforted her, even though she was the one walking toward what felt like certain doom. Now, as dawn broke over London, Evelyn made herself look at the facts. Alexander Ashford, the 7th Duke of Blackstone, age 32, veteran of Waterloo, inherited his title at 20 when his father died, owned estates across England, lived primarily at Blackstone Manor, an isolated estate on the Yorkshire moors, and he'd tried to marry twice. Both women had died. The logical part of Evelyn's mind said it had to be coincidence, bad luck, tragic timing. But the fearful part, the part that had kept her awake all night, whispered darker things. What if the stories were true? What if there was something wrong with him? What if he'd hurt those women? What if she was next? She had 6 days to find out, 6 days before she'd stand at the altar beside London's most feared man. 6 days before she'd either become the Duchess of Blackstone or the 3rd woman to die trying. The meeting was arranged for 2 days later at Lady Pemberton's townhouse, a neutral location where polite society conducted its most delicate business. Evelyn dressed carefully that morning, choosing a simple day dress of pale blue. She wanted to look respectable but not eager, dignified but not defiant. It was a balance she wasn't sure she could strike, not when her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Alice had tried to help with her hair, but Evelyn had finally taken over herself. She couldn't bear the way her maid kept crying, as if she were preparing a lamb for slaughter. Perhaps she was. You don't have to do this, Alice whispered one more time as Evelyn pulled on her gloves. We could run. I have a cousin in Scotland. We could... And condemn Thomas? Condemn you and the other servants when father loses the house. Evelyn shook her head. No, I made my choice. The carriage ride to Lady Pemberton's felt both endless and far too short. Evelyn watched the London streets pass by, wondering if these might be some of the last normal moments of her life. By tonight, she would have met the man who might kill her. The thought should have been absurd, melodramatic, but 2 dead fiancés made it feel terrifyingly real. Lady Pemberton greeted her at the door with sympathetic eyes. The older woman had known Evelyn's mother before she died, and there was genuine concern in her face. "My dear," she said softly, taking Evelyn's hands, "you look pale. Would you like some tea before—" "No, thank you," Evelyn said. Her stomach couldn't handle anything right now. "I'd rather just proceed." Lady Pemberton nodded and led her to a private drawing room. "He's already here. Arrived precisely on time. Very proper." She paused at the door. "Evelyn, if you need anything at all—" "I'm right outside." Then she opened the door, and Evelyn stepped into the room where her future waited. He stood by the window, his back to her, hands clasped behind him in a military stance. Even from behind he was imposing. Tall, easily over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that filled his black coat. Everything about him was dark. Dark hair, dark clothes. Even the air around him seemed somehow heavier. "Miss Hartley," he said without turning. His voice was deep, controlled, with none of the warmth or courtesy she was used to from English gentlemen. It was the voice of a man who gave commands and expected them to be followed. "Your Grace," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. He turned then, and Evelyn had to force herself not to step back. Alexander Ashford was not handsome in any conventional sense. His face was too harsh, too angular, carved from stone rather than painted by some romantic artist. His nose looked like it had been broken at least once. His jaw was square and set in a permanent expression of severity. But it was the scar that drew the eye. A jagged line that ran from his left temple down to his jaw, cutting through his eyebrow and just missing his eye. It was old, healed, but prominent, a reminder of violence, and his eyes, grey as winter storm clouds, cold, assessing, looking at her the way a general might survey a battlefield. "Please sit," he said, gesturing to a chair. It wasn't a request. Evelyn sat. He remained standing, studying her for a long moment. She forced herself to meet his gaze, though everything in her wanted to look away. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her cower. "Not yet. Your father explained the situation," he said finally. "You understand the terms of the arrangement. I understand that my father's debts are considerable and that you've offered to clear them in exchange for my hand in marriage," Evelyn replied. "What I don't understand is why." Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps. "You're direct." "I see no point in pretense, Your Grace. You're buying me. I'd like to know what I'm being purchased for." A muscle twitched in his jaw. "I need a wife. You need your family's debts cleared. It's a practical arrangement." "You've tried to acquire a wife twice before," Evelyn said, her heart pounding. "Both times ended in tragedy. Forgive me for wondering if practicality is your only motivation." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Alexander Ashford's expression didn't change, but something in his stillness became dangerous. "You've heard the stories," he said. "Not a question. Everyone has heard the stories, and you believe them." Evelyn chose her words carefully. "I believe 2 women are dead. I believe you were engaged to both of them. Beyond that, I know nothing." He moved then, crossing to stand directly in front of her. Evelyn's instinct screamed at her to run, but she stayed seated, looking up at him. "Are you afraid of me, Miss Hartley?" The question was soft, almost gentle, but there was something underneath it, something that sounded like resignation. Evelyn could have lied. Perhaps she should have, but she'd already decided that if she was going to die, she'd at least die honest. "Yes," she said simply. "I'm afraid of you." He nodded slowly, as if she'd confirmed something he already knew. "Good," he said. "Fear keeps one cautious. Caution keeps one alive." Then he stepped back, that military distance returning. "The wedding will take place in 5 days at St. Paul's Cathedral. I've arranged for a dress to be delivered to your home. Your father will provide the guest list. Do you have any questions?" Evelyn had 1,000 questions. Why St. Paul's, one of the largest churches in London? Why such a public ceremony for what was essentially a private transaction? Why did he look at her with such carefully controlled nothing in his eyes? But she asked the only question that really mattered. "Will I survive this marriage, Your Grace?" For the first time his expression shifted. Something that might have been pain crossed his face, gone so quickly she almost missed it. "That," he said quietly, "is entirely up to fate." Then he bowed, a precise military bow, and left the room. Evelyn sat alone in Lady Pemberton's drawing room, her heart racing, her mind spinning. She'd just met the man she was going to marry in 5 days, the devil Duke of Blackstone, and she had no idea if he was a monster or simply a man that tragedy followed like a shadow. The next 5 days passed in a blur of preparation that felt more like a countdown to execution. The dress arrived as promised, delivered by a seamstress who measured Evelyn with pitying eyes. It was beautiful, she had to admit. White silk with delicate lace at the sleeves and neckline. Simple, elegant, expensive. Nothing like the elaborate gowns brides usually wore, but Evelyn suspected that was intentional. This wasn't a celebration, it was a contract being fulfilled. Thomas came home from what remained of his time at Oxford, his young face tight with guilt. At 16, he was caught between boyhood and manhood, and the weight of what was happening because of their father's mistakes sat heavily on his shoulders. "Evie," he said the night before the wedding, catching her alone in the library. "You don't have to do this. We'll find another way. I'll leave school, I'll find work." "And work for how many years to pay £15,000? Evelyn asked gently. "No, Thomas, this is done. The arrangements are made. But they say he's dangerous. They say he killed those women." "They say a lot of things," Evelyn replied, though she'd thought the same things herself through countless sleepless nights. "What matters is that your education will be secured. You'll have opportunities I never had. Promise me you'll use them well." Thomas's eyes filled with tears he was too proud to let fall. "I'll never forget this, Evie. Never. I swear I'll make something of myself. I'll make sure your sacrifice means something." "Just be happy," Evelyn said, hugging her brother tight. "That's all I want. Be happy and be good." The morning of the wedding dawned cold and grey. Typical March weather in London. Evelyn woke early, having barely slept at all. Alice came to help her dress, her hands gentler than usual, as if Evelyn might break. The white silk dress fit perfectly. Alice arranged her hair in a simple style, weaving in small white flowers that matched the lace on the dress. No veil. The Duke hadn't provided one, and Evelyn didn't ask for one. She wanted to see clearly, to face whatever was coming with her eyes open. There was no crowd of family and friends to see her off, no mother to cry and fuss over her, no father to offer awkward comfort. Lord Hartley had already left for the cathedral, unable to meet his daughter's eyes. It would be Thomas who escorted her, and even that small kindness made Evelyn's throat tight with emotion. "You look beautiful, Evie," Thomas said when she came downstairs. His voice cracked on the words. "I look like a bride," Evelyn replied. "That's all that matters today." The carriage ride to St. Paul's Cathedral took 20 minutes through London's morning streets. With each passing block, Evelyn felt the weight of what was about to happen settle more heavily on her shoulders. This was real. This was happening. In less than an hour, she would be the Duchess of Blackstone, married to a man she'd met once, a man whose previous fiancés had died, a man that society whispered was either cursed or evil, or both. St. Paul's Cathedral rose before them, its massive dome dominating the London skyline. It was one of the grandest churches in England, built to hold thousands, and as their carriage approached, Evelyn saw that it was packed. "My God," Thomas breathed beside her. "The whole city must be here." He wasn't far wrong. The steps leading to the cathedral were crowded with people, and not just the usual society guests who attended fashionable weddings. These were ordinary Londoners, people who'd come to witness the spectacle. The Devil Duke was getting married again, and they wanted to see if this bride would make it to the altar, or if tragedy would strike a third time. The whispers started the moment Evelyn stepped out of the carriage. She could hear them rippling through the crowd like wind through wheat, growing louder as Thomas helped her down and offered his arm. "That's her." The third one. "Poor girl, doesn't stand a chance, then look how young she is. Shame, really. I give her a month before something happens." Evelyn kept her chin high and her eyes forward. She would not give these people the satisfaction of seeing her afraid, even though her heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Thomas's arm trembled slightly under her hand, and she squeezed it gently, as much to comfort herself as him. The cathedral steps seemed endless. Each one took her closer to the massive doors, closer to the altar, closer to Alexander Ashford. Around them, London's elite parted to let them pass. Ladies in their finest gowns stared with a mixture of pity and morbid fascination. Gentlemen exchanged knowing looks and shook their heads. Everyone had come for the same reason, to see if history would repeat itself, to witness whether the Devil Duke's curse would claim another victim. Inside, the cathedral was even more overwhelming. The vaulted ceilings soared overhead, and hundreds of candles cast flickering shadows across the stone walls. Every pew was filled, packed with more than 300 witnesses. Evelyn had never seen so many people gathered in one place, all of them watching her. Waiting to see what would happen, the organ began to play, a somber melody that felt more appropriate for a funeral than a wedding. Thomas walked her slowly down the long aisle, their footsteps echoing on the marble floor. Evelyn kept her breathing steady, counting each step. 1, 2, 3. She would not faint. She would not run. She would face this with whatever dignity she could muster. And there at the altar stood Alexander Ashford. He was dressed entirely in black, except for a white cravat at his throat. No concessions to wedding tradition, no touch of color or celebration. He looked like he was attending an execution, his face carved from stone, his expression completely unreadable. As Evelyn approached, his grey eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Thomas delivered her to the altar and stepped back, his part done. Evelyn stood alone beside the Duke, feeling small next to his imposing height. She could smell his cologne, something dark and woody, and feel the heat radiating from his body despite the coolness of the cathedral. The Archbishop of Canterbury himself stood ready to perform the ceremony, his elderly face grave. This was no ordinary wedding, and everyone knew it. The weight of expectation hung heavy in the air, the unspoken question on everyone's mind. Would she survive what came next? "Dearly beloved," the Archbishop began, his voice carrying through the silent cathedral, "we are gathered here today in the sight of God to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The words washed over Evelyn like a wave. This was happening. This was real. In minutes, she would be bound to this man for life, however long that life might be. The Archbishop continued through the traditional ceremony, speaking of love and commitment, honor and devotion. The irony wasn't lost on Evelyn. There was no love here, no devotion. Just a transaction dressed up in sacred words. Alexander Ashford, Duke of Blackstone, the Archbishop said, wilt thou have this woman to be thy wedded wife, to live together after God's ordinance in the holy estate of matrimony? Wilt thou love her, comfort her, honor and keep her, in sickness and in health, and forsaking all others? Keep thee only unto her, so long as ye both shall live. Alexander's voice was steady, clear, betraying nothing. I will. Then it was Evelyn's turn. The Archbishop repeated the question, and she heard her own voice, small but determined, echo through the cathedral. I will. The Archbishop opened his mouth to continue, ready to speak the words that would legally bind them. But before he could, something happened that no one expected. Alexander turned, not slightly, not politely, but fully, turning his entire body to face Evelyn directly. His movement was so sudden, so deliberate, that the Archbishop stopped mid-word. A ripple of confusion ran through the assembled crowd. Evelyn's heart stopped. This was it. He was going to refuse. He was going to humiliate her in front of all these people. Or worse, something terrible was about to happen, just like with the others. But Alexander didn't speak to the Archbishop. He didn't address the crowd. He looked directly at Evelyn, his grey eyes holding hers with an intensity that made everything else fade away. And then he reached out and took both of her hands in his. The touch was shocking, intimate. No one did such things during the ceremony. It broke every rule of propriety. Gasps echoed through the cathedral, followed by a silence so complete that Evelyn could hear her own heartbeat. Before God and these witnesses, Alexander said, his deep voice carrying to every corner of the cathedral, I must speak. The Archbishop looked bewildered. Your Grace, this is most irregular. I don't care, Alexander said, cutting him off without taking his eyes from Evelyn's face. What I have to say cannot wait. Evelyn felt frozen, trapped in his gaze, her hands warm in his larger ones. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The moment when tragedy struck. She braced herself for whatever came next, but Alexander's next words shattered every expectation in the room. Miss Hartley, he began, his voice softer now, but no less powerful. You stand here today not by choice, but by necessity. Your father's debts have bound you to a man you fear, to a title shadowed by tragedy. London calls me cursed. They call me cruel. They call me the Devil Duke. And they wait with bated breath for you to become the third ghost in my halls. The crowd erupted in whispers. Ladies reached for their fans. Gentlemen shifted uncomfortably. No one had expected him to address the rumors so directly, so publicly. But I will not allow it, Alexander continued, his grip on her hands tightening slightly. I will not stand here and bind you to a fate you dread. I will not force you into a marriage that fills you with terror. I will not be the cause of another tragedy. Evelyn's mind reeled. Was he refusing the marriage? After everything, after her father's debts, after all the preparation, was he going to leave her at the altar? But Alexander wasn't finished. Before all assembled here, he said, his voice growing stronger, I make you this vow. You will never know fear in my house. You will never be bound by duty alone. You will have your own chambers, your own wing, your own life separate from mine. I ask nothing from you that you do not freely give. The cathedral had gone completely silent. 300 people held their breath, trying to understand what they were hearing. No duty of the marriage bed, Alexander continued, each word clear and deliberate. No performance for society. No pretense of affection you do not feel. You will be the Duchess of Blackstone in name and in protection, but in truth you will be free, more free than any married woman in England. Evelyn felt tears gathering in her eyes. She couldn't speak, couldn't move, could barely breathe. What was he saying? What was he offering? And should you ever wish to leave, Alexander said, his voice dropping lower, meant for her alone but carrying still through the silent space. Should you find happiness elsewhere, should you decide that even this arrangement is too much to bear, I will grant you an annulment quietly, with a fortune enough to live independently for the rest of your days. You will never be trapped. You will never be powerless. You will never be at the mercy of a man's whims. A single tear slipped down Evelyn's cheek. She saw something flicker in Alexander's eyes, something that might have been pain or regret or something deeper. This I swear, he concluded, his voice ringing through the cathedral like a bell. On my honor as a soldier, on my title as Duke of Blackstone, and on the memory of Lady Caroline and Miss Isabel, those I failed to protect before you. I will not fail you, Evelyn Hartley. I will give you the one thing no one else can, your freedom. The silence that followed was absolute. Evelyn stared at Alexander, her vision blurred with tears, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. He had just promised her freedom, in front of 300 witnesses, in front of the Archbishop, in front of all of London society. He had just vowed to give her a life of her own choosing. Why? She whispered, the only word she could manage. Alexander's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Because I will not be the cause of another light going out in this world, he said quietly. Because you deserve better than to be sold for your father's mistakes. Because 2 women are dead and I will not make it 3. More tears spilled down Evelyn's cheeks. Around them, the cathedral erupted in chaos. Ladies were crying into their handkerchiefs. Gentlemen were arguing in loud whispers. The Archbishop looked completely lost, his hands fluttering uselessly as he tried to understand what protocol demanded in such an unprecedented situation. But Evelyn barely heard any of it. All she could see was Alexander, this man everyone feared, this duke everyone called cursed, offering her something she'd never expected to have. Choice. Your Grace, the Archbishop finally managed, his voice shaking slightly, this is most unusual. The vows are traditional. They cannot be altered in such a manner. They can, Alexander said, finally looking away from Evelyn to address the Archbishop. And they will be. These are my terms. If Miss Hartley accepts them, we will proceed. If she does not, I will not hold her to this arrangement. Every eye in the cathedral turned to Evelyn, 300 people waiting for her answer. Would she accept? Would she refuse? What could she possibly say to such an offer? Evelyn looked at Alexander, really looked at him. His scarred face was serious, his grey eyes steady. He meant every word. She could see it in the set of his jaw, in the way he held himself. This wasn't a trick or a trap. This was a man who had watched 2 women die because they feared him, and he was determined not to let it happen again. I accept, she said, her voice stronger than she felt. I accept your vows, Your Grace. Something in Alexander's expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but a loosening of the severe lines around his mouth. Relief, perhaps. Or maybe just acknowledgement. "Then let us proceed," he said to the Archbishop. The Archbishop fumbled through the rest of the ceremony in a daze, clearly uncertain how to proceed after such an unprecedented interruption. But he managed to stumble through the remaining vows, his hands shaking slightly as he blessed the union. When he finally pronounced them man and wife, his voice was barely audible over the murmurs that still rippled through the crowd. "You may kiss the bride," the Archbishop said. Though he sounded uncertain even about this traditional moment, Alexander didn't kiss her. Instead, he bowed formally over her hand, his lips barely brushing her gloved knuckles. It was proper, respectful, and maintained the distance he'd just promised her. Even in this, he was keeping his word. They walked back down the aisle together, her hand resting lightly on his arm. The whispers followed them like a storm, louder now, filled with shock and speculation. What had they just witnessed? Had the Devil Duke actually promised his bride freedom? Was this some kind of trick? What would happen now? Evelyn kept her head high, but inside she felt numb. Everything had happened so fast. One moment she'd been preparing for a marriage of duty and fear, and the next, Alexander had turned the entire ceremony on its head with a promise no one had expected. Outside the cathedral, there was no receiving line, no well-wishers throwing rice or flower petals. Alexander's black carriage waited at the bottom of the steps, the black stone crest gleaming on its door. A footman stood ready to help her inside, but before she could move, Alexander spoke. "Your family's debts have been cleared as of this morning," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Your brother's education is fully funded through university and beyond. Your father's creditors have been paid. You owe me nothing, Evelyn. Remember that." Then he helped her into the carriage himself, his hand steady and warm even through her glove. He climbed in after her and took the seat across from her, not beside her, maintaining distance, keeping his promise even now. The carriage pulled away from St. Paul's, leaving the chaos behind. Through the window, Evelyn could see people still gathered on the steps, talking animatedly, their hands gesturing wildly as they discussed what they'd just witnessed. By tonight, every drawing room in London would be talking about nothing else. Inside the carriage, silence reigned. Evelyn didn't know what to say. "Thank you" seemed inadequate. "Why did you do that?" seemed too bold. So she said nothing, watching the city pass by as they made their way north out of London toward the Yorkshire moors. Alexander stared out his window, his profile hard and unreadable. The scar on his face caught the afternoon light, a reminder of battles fought and survived. He'd been at Waterloo, she remembered. He'd seen men die. He'd almost died himself. What had that done to him? What had made him into the man who would promise freedom to a stranger? The journey took 3 hours. They stopped once to change horses, and Alexander asked if she needed refreshment. She declined. Her stomach was too knotted to consider food. He simply nodded, and they continued on. As the city gave way to countryside, and the countryside grew wilder and more desolate, Evelyn began to understand why Blackstone Manor had such a dark reputation. The landscape was beautiful in its own harsh way, all rolling moors and rocky outcroppings, but it felt isolated, lonely, the kind of place where you could scream and no one would hear. "Stop it," she told herself firmly. "He'd just promised you safety. You're letting fear control you." But old habits died hard, and the stories of Lady Caroline and Miss Isabel whispered in the back of her mind. Finally, as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the moors in shades of gold and purple, she saw it. Blackstone Manor rose from the landscape like something out of a Gothic novel. Dark stone walls, towers reaching toward the sky, windows that reflected the dying light like watching eyes. It was magnificent and intimidating in equal measure. The carriage rolled through massive iron gates and up a long drive lined with ancient trees. As they approached the main entrance, Evelyn saw a line of servants waiting to greet them, at least 30 people standing at attention in their livery. Alexander noticed her looking. "The staff," he said simply. "They've been preparing for your arrival." The carriage stopped and footmen rushed to open the doors. Alexander stepped out first, then turned to help Evelyn down. As her feet touched the gravel drive, all the servants bowed or curtsied in perfect unison. "For your grace," said a woman stepping forward from the line. She was perhaps 50, with iron-grey hair pulled back severely and sharp eyes that missed nothing. But her face was kind, and when she smiled at Evelyn, it was genuine. "Welcome to Blackstone Manor. I'm Mrs. Brennan." "The housekeeper." "Thank you," Evelyn managed, though her voice sounded small in the vast courtyard. Alexander spoke then, his voice carrying authority that made every servant stand a little straighter. "Mrs. Brennan will show you to your quarters. The Duchess will reside in the East Wing." He paused, then added with emphasis, "Her privacy is absolute. No one enters her rooms without her express permission. No one disturbs her unless she requests it. Here's that understood?" "Yes, Your Grace," came the chorus of voices. "Good." Alexander turned to Evelyn. "If you'll follow Mrs. Brennan, she'll show you your rooms. I'll have dinner sent up to you. You must be exhausted." He was already creating distance, already keeping his promise. Evelyn should have felt relieved. But instead, she felt oddly abandoned. Mrs. Brennan led her into the manor, through a massive entrance hall with soaring ceilings and dark wood paneling. "This way, Your Grace," she said warmly. "The East Wing is quite lovely. His Grace had it completely refurbished for you." They climbed a grand staircase and walked down a long corridor lined with portraits of stern-faced Ashfords from centuries past. Finally, Mrs. Brennan opened a set of double doors and gestured Evelyn inside. The rooms were breathtaking. A sitting room opened into a bedroom, which connected to a dressing room and private bathroom. But beyond those were more doors leading to other spaces. Mrs. Brennan showed her through them all with obvious pride. "Your private library," she said, opening one door to reveal floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with volumes. His Grace had these selected, based on what he learned of your interests. "If there's anything else you'd like, simply let me know." Another door. "Your art studio, fully stocked with paints, canvases, everything you might need." Another door. "Your private garden. It's walled, completely secluded. You can come and go as you please." Evelyn walked through the suite in a daze. This wasn't a prison. This was a sanctuary. Every room was beautifully appointed, comfortable, designed for someone who would actually live here, rather than just occupy space. "And His Grace's rooms?" she asked quietly. "The West Wing, Your Grace, quite far from here." Mrs. Brennan's expression was carefully neutral. "There are no connecting doors between the wings." His Grace was very specific about that. Of course he was. He'd meant every word of his promise. That night, alone in her beautiful rooms, Evelyn tried to make sense of everything that had happened. She'd expected a monster, and found instead a man determined not to be one. She'd expected captivity and found freedom. She'd expected fear and found only confusion. Who was Alexander Ashford? And why had 2 women died? The first week at Blackstone Manor passed in strange, quiet isolation. Evelyn woke each morning in her comfortable bed, ate breakfast alone in her sitting room, and spent her days exploring the East Wing and its grounds. The walled garden became her favorite retreat, filled with roses that were just beginning to bloom and stone benches where she could sit and think. Alexander kept his distance exactly as promised. She saw him only at dinner, and even that was optional. The first night, a maid had come to ask if she would be dining in her rooms or joining His Grace in the dining hall. Evelyn had chosen her rooms, too overwhelmed to face him. The second night, curiosity got the better of her. The dining room was enormous, designed to host dozens of guests, but only 2 places were set at one end of the long table. Alexander stood when she entered, a gesture of respect that surprised her. "Good evening," he said formally. "Good evening, Your Grace." "Alexander," he corrected gently. "We agreed you would call me Alexander." "Alexander," she repeated, testing the name on her tongue. Dinner was polite and painfully awkward. He asked about her comfort, whether her rooms were satisfactory, if she needed anything. She gave brief answers, still uncertain how to navigate this strange arrangement. When the meal ended, he stood, bowed, and left immediately. No lingering. No expectations, just as he'd promised. But each night that she chose to dine with him, their conversations grew slightly longer. He asked about the books she was reading. She asked about his work on the estate. Small talk, careful and safe, but it was something. The servants were her real source of information. They clearly adored Alexander, which confused Evelyn. How could the Devil Duke inspire such loyalty? Mrs. Brennan was particularly forthcoming. One afternoon she found Evelyn in the library and asked if she might bring tea. Over cups of Earl Grey, the housekeeper began to share stories. His Grace employs more than 50 men from the war. Mrs. Brennan said. Veterans who couldn't find work elsewhere. He gives them positions here, pays them fairly, treats them with respect. Some of them were badly injured, but he doesn't care. He says they served their country and deserve better than begging on street corners. Evelyn set down her teacup. That's very kind of him. Kind doesn't begin to cover it, Your Grace. Some of those men were ready to end their lives. He saved them. Mrs. Brennan's expression grew more serious. His Grace isn't what London says he is. He's a good man who's had terrible luck. The previous fiancés, Evelyn said carefully. What really happened to them? Mrs. Brennan sighed heavily. Lady Caroline was first. Beautiful girl, but terrified of His Grace from the moment she met him. She couldn't look at him without flinching. His scar, you see, it frightened her. He tried to be gentle, tried to give her time, but she only grew more afraid. And the accident? She was coming here for a pre-wedding visit. The carriage was still miles from the manor when it happened. The driver said she'd been agitated the whole journey, kept asking him to turn back. Then she saw Blackstone Manor in the distance and she panicked. Started screaming that she couldn't do it, that she had to get away. She grabbed the door handle, tried to jump from the moving carriage. The driver tried to stop, but the horses spooked. The carriage overturned. Mrs. Brennan's eyes were sad. She died instantly. His Grace blamed himself, said he should have released her from the engagement when he saw how afraid she was. Evelyn felt her chest tighten. And Miss Isabel? Miss Isabel was different, quieter. She seemed resigned to the marriage, but never happy about it. His Grace tried again to be kind, to make her comfortable, but she wouldn't speak to him, wouldn't look at him. The week before the wedding, she seemed even more withdrawn. Then one morning her maid found her. Mrs. Brennan's voice dropped. She'd taken laudanum. Too much to be an accident. She killed herself, Evelyn whispered. The official story was heart failure. His Grace insisted on that, to protect her family from scandal. But yes, Your Grace, she couldn't face marrying him and she saw no other way out. Mrs. Brennan looked directly at Evelyn. That's why His Grace made you that promise in the cathedral. He won't trap another woman into a marriage that terrifies her. He won't be responsible for another death. That night Evelyn couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Alexander, about the weight he carried. 2 women had died, not because he'd hurt them, but because they'd been so afraid of him they'd destroyed themselves rather than become his wife. How did someone live with that guilt? Around midnight, unable to bear the confines of her room any longer, she wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and ventured out. The manor was quiet, lit only by occasional candles in wall sconces. She found herself drawn to the library she'd noticed on the ground floor, larger and more impressive than her private one. The door was ajar, candlelight spilling into the hallway. Evelyn pushed it open quietly and stopped. Alexander sat in a leather chair by the fireplace, a book open in his lap. He'd removed his jacket and cravat, his shirt open at the collar. He looked younger like this, less intimidating, more human. He looked up at her entrance, surprise crossing his face. Evelyn, I didn't expect anyone else to be awake. I couldn't sleep, she admitted. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to intrude. You're not intruding. This is your home now, too. He gestured to the chair across from him. Would you like to sit? She should have declined, should have returned to her room. But something about the quiet intimacy of the moment made her brave. She sat down. What are you reading? She asked. He showed her the cover. Marcus Aurelius, Meditations. The Stoic philosopher, Evelyn said, recognizing it. My tutor made me read him years ago. Did you enjoy it? Some of it. I appreciated his thoughts on duty and honor, though I found his acceptance of fate rather cold. Alexander's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but close. That's a fair criticism. The Stoics believed we should accept what we cannot change and focus only on what we can control. Our own thoughts, our own actions. And what of emotion? What of feeling? Evelyn asked. He seems to dismiss them as weaknesses, perhaps. Or perhaps he understood that unchecked emotion can destroy us. Alexander's expression grew distant. I've seen men driven mad by fear on the battlefield. I've watched others consumed by rage until they became monsters. The Stoics teach us to observe our emotions without being ruled by them. They talked for over an hour, discussing philosophy, sharing perspectives. Evelyn found herself relaxing, engaging with ideas rather than fear. Alexander listened to her opinions with genuine interest, never dismissing her thoughts, sometimes challenging them in ways that made her think deeper. Finally, Evelyn voiced the question that had been haunting her since her conversation with Mrs. Brennan. "Do you regret your promise? The one you made in the cathedral?" Alexander set down his book and looked at her directly. "No, why do you ask?" "Because I'm costing you an heir, a true marriage. Everything a duchess is supposed to provide. You assume those things matter more to me than your well-being," he said quietly. "They don't, but why? You don't know me. We're strangers. Because I've seen what happens when women are forced into marriages they fear. I've lived with that guilt for 2 years. I won't add to it." He paused. "You may call me Alexander. We are married after all, even if it's not a conventional marriage. And what shall I call you when we're alone like this? Your grace seems absurd between husband and wife." "Alexander," he said. "Just Alexander." Something shifted between them in that moment, a small crack in the wall of formality they'd built. As Evelyn returned to her rooms later, she realized the fear she'd carried since her father's study had begun to ease. Alexander Ashford wasn't a monster. He was just a man, scarred inside and out, trying not to cause more harm. The morning after their library conversation, Evelyn woke with a strange lightness in her chest. For the first time since her father had summoned her to his study, she didn't feel the crushing weight of dread. Instead, she felt something she hadn't expected. Curiosity. She began joining Alexander for breakfast in the conservatory, a bright room filled with plants and morning sunlight. Their conversations continued, growing easier each day. He told her about his work managing the estate, the tenant farmers he supported, the improvements he was making to their lands. She shared her love of reading, her frustration at never being allowed to pursue real education beyond what was considered appropriate for ladies. "You wanted to be a scholar," he observed one morning over coffee. "Is that so ridiculous?" she asked, half defensive. "Not at all. It's a tragedy that intelligence in women is considered threatening rather than valuable." He set down his cup. "The library is yours, all of it. And if you'd like, I can arrange for tutors. Mathematics, science, philosophy, whatever you wish to study." Evelyn stared at him. "You would do that?" "Why wouldn't I? Your mind is wasted on watercolors and embroidery." He said it matter-of-factly, as if offering educational opportunities to one's wife was the most natural thing in the world. Their days developed a rhythm. Mornings together, then Alexander would leave to manage estate business while Evelyn read or painted. Afternoons she'd walk the grounds, sometimes seeing him in the distance working alongside his men in the fields, his coat discarded, shirt sleeves rolled up. She learned he never asked his workers to do anything he wouldn't do himself. Evenings brought chess matches in the library. Alexander was an excellent player, but Evelyn had been taught by her grandfather and could hold her own. Their games became a kind of conversation without words, each move revealing something about how they thought. "You play defensively," Alexander observed one evening after she'd blocked his queen. "I've learned that protecting what matters is more important than aggressive offense," she replied. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "A sound strategy, though sometimes the boldest move is the one that wins the game." 6 weeks into their marriage, a violent spring storm rolled across the moors. Evelyn had always been terrified of thunderstorms, ever since she was a child and lightning had struck a tree outside her nursery window. The crash and the flames had given her nightmares for years. That night, as thunder shook the manor and lightning illuminated her bedroom in harsh flashes, Evelyn found herself curled on her bed, shaking, unable to calm her racing heart. She tried to reason with herself. She was safe. The manor was solid stone. Nothing would happen. But fear didn't respond to reason. A knock at her door made her jump. "Evelyn," Alexander's voice concerned. "Are you all right?" Mrs. Brennan said she heard crying. She couldn't answer. Another crack of thunder made her whimper. "May I come in?" he asked. She managed a shaky, "Yes." The door opened and Alexander entered, still fully dressed despite the late hour. He took in her state immediately, her tear-stained face, her trembling hands, her inability to speak. "The storm," he said, understanding. He stayed near the door, not approaching. "It frightens you." She nodded, embarrassed by her weakness. "May I sit?" he asked, gesturing to a chair across the room. Another nod. He sat, maintaining distance, respecting her space even now. Then he began to talk. His voice was steady, calm, grounding. He told her about Waterloo, about the cannon fire that had been so loud it deafened men permanently, about learning to function despite fear, to find the quiet center inside yourself when chaos raged outside. I was terrified, he admitted. Every soldier who says otherwise is a liar. But I learned that fear doesn't have to control you. You acknowledge it, and then you choose to act anyway. As he talked, Evelyn's breathing began to slow. His voice was an anchor, pulling her back from panic. Lightning flashed again, but this time she focused on his words instead of the storm. The men who saved my life at Waterloo, Alexander continued, they're here now, working my land. I owe them everything. That's why I give them positions, why I pay them fairly. Because they taught me what courage really means. It's not the absence of fear, it's continuing despite it. Without thinking, Evelyn reached out her hand. Alexander saw the gesture and moved closer, taking the chair beside her bed. He let her grip his hand, her fingers cold against his warm ones. They sat like that through the storm, his hand in hers, his voice steady and calm. He told her stories about the men who worked his estate, about the changes he wanted to make, about his plans for the future. Normal things, safe things, until the thunder grew distant and the lightning faded. When silence finally returned, Evelyn realized she was still holding his hand. And she didn't want to let go. Thank you, she whispered. Always, he said simply. He started to pull away, to return to his wing, but her grip tightened. Stay, she said. Please, just until I fall asleep. Something flickered in his eyes. Are you certain? I'm certain. So Alexander stayed, sitting in the chair beside her bed, her hand in his, until her breathing deepened and she drifted into sleep. When she woke the next morning, he was gone, but a blanket had been draped over her that hadn't been there before. He'd stayed longer than she'd asked, making sure she was truly at peace. That morning, Evelyn knew she needed to speak to him. Something had changed in her, something fundamental. She found him in his study, reviewing papers. Alexander, she said from the doorway, may I speak with you? He stood immediately. Of course. Come in. She closed the door behind her, her heart pounding, but this time it wasn't fear making it race. I need to tell you something, she began. When I married you, I was terrified. I thought you were a monster. I thought I was walking to my death. His expression remained carefully neutral, but she saw the tension in his shoulders. But these past weeks, she continued, you've shown me more kindness, more respect than anyone in my life. You've given me freedom I never dreamed possible. You've treated me as an equal, valued my thoughts, protected me without controlling me. Evelyn, please let me finish. She took a breath. I find that I don't want such distance between us anymore. I don't want separate wings and formal dinners and careful politeness. I want to know you, the real you, and I want you to know me. Alexander stood very still. You don't have to say this. The arrangement we made, I know I don't have to. That's precisely why I want to. You gave me choice. So I'm choosing. She moved closer to him. I'm choosing you. Evelyn, I'm not an easy man to love. I'm scarred inside and out. I'm difficult and set in my ways. I've failed before, and I'm not a woman who loves easily, she interrupted. I'm stubborn and opinionated, and I've spent my whole life being told I think too much. Yet here we are. They stood facing each other, the air between them charged with possibility. Alexander's grey eyes searched her face, looking for doubt, for fear. He found neither. If I kiss you now, he said quietly, it won't be for duty. It won't be to secure an heir. It will be because I've wanted to since the moment you stood in that cathedral and chose bravery over fear. Evelyn's breath caught. Then kiss me, husband. He crossed the space between them slowly, giving her every chance to change her mind. But she didn't move, didn't retreat. When he finally cupped her face in his hands, his touch was gentle, reverent, as if she was something precious. Their first kiss was soft, tentative, a question being asked and answered. Then deeper, more certain as weeks of careful distance finally broke. When they pulled apart, both were breathless. I love you, Evelyn whispered, surprising herself with the truth of it. Alexander rested his forehead against hers. I loved you the moment you said you feared me, and chose bravery anyway. Every day since has only deepened it. That night, Evelyn moved her belongings to the West Wing, not because she had to, not because society expected it, but because she chose him, chose this life, chose love over fear, The royal summons arrived on a Tuesday morning, sealed with crimson wax bearing the Queen's insignia. Alexander read it twice before setting it down with deliberate care. "We're commanded to attend the Queen's ball," he said quietly. "In 3 weeks' time." Evelyn looked up from her breakfast, her teacup pausing halfway to her lips. 3 months of blissful isolation at Blackstone Manor had made London feel like another world entirely, a world she'd been quite content to forget. "Can we refuse?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Not the Queen." Alexander's jaw tightened. "They'll be waiting for us. The whole city will want to see if the Devil Duke's third bride has survived." "Let them look," Evelyn said, setting down her cup with more confidence than she felt. "I know the truth. That's all that matters." But Alexander crossed to her chair, kneeling beside it to take her hands. "They will be cruel, Evelyn. Society doesn't forgive easily, and they won't understand what we have." She touched his scarred cheek gently. "Then we'll show them." 3 weeks later, Evelyn stood before her mirror in their London townhouse, barely recognizing herself. The woman looking back wore a gown of deep crimson silk, the color of courage, of transformation. Her maid had woven pearls through her dark hair, and around her neck hung the Blackstone rubies. Worn by duchesses for 2 centuries, Alexander appeared in the doorway, resplendent in formal black, with his military medals gleaming on his chest. His eyes widened when he saw her. "You're magnificent," he breathed. "I'm terrified," she admitted. He crossed to her, offering his arm. "Then we'll be terrified together. But we'll be honest. That's more than anyone in that ballroom can claim." The carriage ride to the palace felt both endless and far too short. When they arrived, the entrance hall fell silent as a tomb. 300 members of the ton stopped mid-conversation, every eye fixed on the Devil Duke and his mysteriously surviving Duchess. Evelyn felt Alexander's arm tense beneath her hand, but she held her head high as they descended the stairs. The whispers started immediately. "She's alive. She looks radiant. Is the Duke actually smiling?" They made their way through the crowd, which parted before them like water before a ship's prow. The stares were heavy, judgmental, hungry for scandal. But Evelyn kept her eyes forward, her hand steady on Alexander's arm. When they reached the dance floor, the orchestra began a waltz. Alexander turned to her, his grey eyes questioning. She answered by stepping into his arms. They danced and the world fell away. She'd forgotten how beautifully he moved, how perfectly they fit together. His hand at her waist was sure and gentle, his gaze never leaving her face. And when she smiled up at him, a genuine, joyful smile, something shifted in the ballroom's atmosphere. "They're staring," Alexander murmured. "Let them," Evelyn replied. They've never seen love before. After the dance, Lady Pemberton approached with her typical lack of subtlety. "My dear Duchess, you look remarkably well. Quite different from our last meeting. Tell me, how have you managed to tame the Devil Duke?" The crowd around them hushed, eager for her response. Evelyn met Lady Pemberton's eyes steadily. "I did no such thing, my lady. I simply saw the man behind the mask society forced him to wear." She paused, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent circle. Perhaps if London had bothered to look, truly look, there would have been no devil at all. Only a good man carrying scars given to him by war and by our cruelty. Lady Pemberton had no response. Neither did anyone else. "Come, husband," Evelyn said, turning to Alexander. "Let's go home." They left the ball early, not in retreat but in choice. Their carriage ride back to Blackstone Manor, home, was filled with laughter and relief. The gardens of Blackstone Manor blazed with late summer roses. Evelyn walked among them slowly, one hand resting on her rounded belly, the other trailing through lavender blooms. She was 8 months along, glowing with happiness and health. "There you are," Alexander's voice came from behind her. She turned to find her husband approaching, his coat discarded somewhere, his shirt sleeves rolled up from working the estate. A year of marriage had softened some of his harsh edges, brought light to his grey eyes. He dropped to his knees before her without hesitation, pressing his forehead gently against her belly. Their child kicked in response, and Alexander laughed, a sound that still felt like a miracle. "Thank you," he whispered against the curve of her stomach. "Thank you for not running. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for choosing me when you didn't have to." Evelyn's fingers wove through his dark hair. "Thank you for the greatest gift," she replied softly. "The freedom to choose love instead of being commanded to it." He rose, pulling her into his arms carefully, reverently. When he kissed her, it tasted of sunshine and roses and promises kept. London no longer called him the Devil Duke, or if they did, neither Alexander nor Evelyn heard it. They'd returned to Blackstone Manor after that one required ball and hadn't left since. Their world was here, in the library where they read together, the gardens where they walked, the chambers where they loved without duty or performance. Only joy. Their child would grow up knowing love, not fear. Knowing choice, not obligation. Knowing that true strength lies in gentleness and true courage in vulnerability. As the sun set over Blackstone Manor, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Alexander held his wife close and thought of the cathedral, of the promise he'd made before 300 witnesses. He'd kept every word, and she'd given him more than he'd ever dared hope for in return. They say love cannot be commanded, only given freely. The Duke of Blackstone knew this truth better than most, and the woman who became his Duchess proved it by choosing to love the man London feared, and finding in him the greatest love of all, the love that trusts, the love that frees, the love that sees beyond scars to the soul beneath, and they lived not happily ever after in the fairy tale sense, but truthfully ever after, which is far better.